Firstly, thank you to the organisers of ProgPal for allowing me this time to speak. My name is Andrew, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Bath. Principally, my research has me thinking about trends in the evolution of biological complexity, and more specifically, trends in the evolution of morphological complexity. In the last few years, this has had me sort of looking at and thinking about bird skeletons. And well, the title of the talk sort of gives away the ending, but hopefully over the next 10 minutes or so, I can walk you through how I've got to this conclusion. Now, I think the best place to start is by defining exactly what I mean by complexity. And this is important because complexity is often this quite vague term that is thrown around. Even though most people have quite a strong intuitive grasp of what it means for something to be more or less complex, for example, I could ask all of you to rank these three objects in order from least to most complex, and you'd probably all give me the same answer. We need to be a little bit more rigorous than that if we want to measure reliable proxies for complexity that we can use in our analyses. And to that end, I'm going to be relying on this definition here, which has become increasingly prevalent in the biological literature, and that defines the complexity of a structure, whatever it may be, as a function of the number of parts comprising it, the relative differentiation amongst those parts, and also the relative disorder of how they are arranged. Now, pretty much the only thing that people can agree on about how complexity in this sense has evolved is that it has increased since the origin of life, or at the very least that its maximum boundaries have. The exact nature and process of this increase is a bit more contested and debated, and some people, for example Stephen Jay Gould, was quite a vocal proponent of this scenario shown in panel A. This is what we call a passive type trend. What this is we have a long-term increase in the mean value of our trait, whatever it may be, and this is produced simply by an increase in variance through time in the presence of this hard lower boundary. This is what Gould called the left wall. And essentially, well, we can imagine these for any number of biological traits. For example, it's impossible to have a negative body size, and in the same way, it's also possible to have a negative complexity. So if you can imagine that you're evolving, towing along this lower boundary, you've got nowhere to go but up, and that is what creates this trend. And that can be the result either of purely sort of random diffusion, or potentially that could also be generated by heterogeneous evolutionary forces. For example, if natural selection favored higher or lower complexity under different circumstances. And an alternative to this theory is what is shown here in panel B. This is what we call an active type trend, where we can see that things are much more unidirectional and homogeneous. And we expect that these will be produced by circumstances where the evolutionary forces are much more homogeneous. For example, if natural selection always favored greater complexity over lower complexity. There are also some other theories that are floating around in the literature. For example, there's the zero force evolutionary law, which proposes that in the absence of all forces, complexity will simply tend to just accumulate and increase like this. It is, of course, worth noting that lots of this has not been tested very strongly empirically, and that is what I aim to do now. So, principally, the goals of this work are, for the first time, to attempt to quantify complexity in the appendicular skeleton of birds, and then use that quantification to identify whether these putative trends of increasing complexity are really there, and if they are, what is their nature? Are they either active or passive? So, to quantify complexity, we need simple data that is widely available for a large number of species. And to do this, we've settled on measurements, simple linear measurements of these 6 highlighted long bones from the appendicular skeleton. And the first thing that we need to do to process these is to remove all variation in these lengths which is related to the body size of the animal. So firstly, we're going to get rid of isometric size variation, and we're going to do that by taking the mean value of these 6 measurements for each species, and then expressing the measurements as a proportion of that mean. So you can imagine that if all 6 of these bones were the exact same length, all of these numbers would be equal to 1. The next step is that we have to get rid of allometric variation, which is obviously a very important thing to account for. And to do that, what we're going to do is put those isometrically transformed values from the previous slide into a phylogenetic regression against estimates of body mass. And this is going to leave us with some phylogenetic residuals, which we're going to use in all of our next steps. And it is worth noting at this point that we have managed to obtain these phylogenetic residuals for these bone lengths for 1,075 species. That is just short of 1,000 living species and just short of 100 fossil species. Now, to use these measurements to derive a complexity proxy for these 1,075 species, we're going to represent them within a 3-dimensional space, one where each axis represents a different segment of the limbs, and each species is going to be represented by 2 points, one representing the morphology of each limb pair. And then complexity is simply going to be the Euclidean distance between those 2 points. So you can imagine that the simplest possible configuration of these 6 bones is the one where they are all the exact same length. And in that case, there is no differentiation, no disorder of how that differentiation is structured. And these 2 points in the space will plot directly on top of each other. And in that case, complexity will equal 0. Any amount of differentiation away from that, these 2 points will be pulled further apart in the space, and the complexity score will increase. So having calculated a proxy for complexity, how are we going to use that to test for trends and unpick their nature? There are a couple of tools proposed in the literature, and I'm going to focus on this one, which is a variation of the ancestor-descendant test, whereby we're going to use the relative frequency of increases and decreases between ancestral and descendant species. So we expect that under a passive type trend, increases and decreases in complexity are going to be roughly equally probable. Neither one is going to be favored over the other. Whereas under the active type trend, we would expect that either increases or decreases will be significantly more frequent, depending on whether the trending complexity is upwards or downwards. And to try and illustrate to you the protocol that we're going to be using to do this, I've come up with this cartoon example where we have these 6 species A to F, which have been measured for this made-up trait X. And the first step that we're going to do is we're going to perform an ancestral state estimation to infer the values for X at these internal nodes. And the first thing that we can see is that there seems to be a trend of decrease through time in this group of species. The inferred value of X at the root is a little bit over 0.9, whereas the mean value at the tips is a little bit over 0.8. So that is a decrease from the common ancestor to the extent tips. Now, the next step is to simply quantify the differences between these pairs of putative ancestors and descendants. Are they either increases or decreases? And then having done that, we're going to tally them up. And in this case, we have 5 of each, 5 increases shown in blue and 5 decreases shown in red. And then we're going to take those frequencies and we're going to just put those into a simple binomial test. And in this case, neither one is more or less frequent than the other. The binomial p equals 1. And if we refer back to our expectations for the test, that is indicative of a passive type trend of decrease in this example. Now you'll notice that we have our tip values, our complexity scores for our species, but we're also going to need a tree to be able to do this test. So I'm going to very quickly walk you through how I've come up with this tree that I've used. Firstly, I've started with 2 different trees. One is an extant molecular crown phylogeny, which I've pruned down to match the sample, and the other is a species level tree of the stem group of birds. And then I've grafted those together in an appropriate place, and I've manually added some other crown and stem fossils to provide further calibration points for the ancestral state estimation. Following that, I've then recalibrated the whole thing using the Cal3 method implemented in PaleoTree, and that has yielded for all of our 1,075 species a distribution of 250 slightly different trees, which we can use in our analyses. And when we apply the ancestor-descendant test, well, just to look at it, this, at least superficially, looks like a trend of increase. If we plot some things onto this, we can see that the mean value for complexity at the extant tips is more than double that at the root. And if we follow what is happening with maximum complexity here, we can see that our most complex species, this is Bennett's cassowary here at the top, that has a complexity score more than 10-fold that implied for the common ancestor of birds and Archaeopteryx. And if we just, as I say, superficially look at the shape of this plot, it resembles more closely our expectation of a passive type trend shown in panel A. But when we apply the ancestor-descendant test to this, we find that decreases in complexity are actually significantly more frequent, occurring on just over 54% of the internal branches of the tree. This pattern is both consistent and significant across all 250 trees in the test distribution. And this is evidence actually of an active trend of decreasing complexity despite the apparent increases. The exact biological reasons for this, I can't tell you from these results. That requires a bit further investigation. But we think that the overall net increase is probably the result of a smaller number of larger increases. When you compare these next to each other, these are box plots of absolute magnitudes of changes. A Mann-Whitney U-test can't distinguish them. But I think what actually sets these apart are, if I plot on the quite absurd tails of outliers here, we can see that there are a much smaller number of very large increases, which I think probably produce this pattern. So to conclude, we think we've successfully quantified limb skeleton complexity in living and extinct birds, and we have used that to show that actually, even though the putative trends of increase are sort of there, they're not fully supported, and we actually find evidence of the opposite. We find that there is an active trend towards decreasing complexity. And this sort of gives us a few things to take away. Firstly, and most importantly, that real empirical trends are not always as simple as our basic expectations for them, nor are they always how they look. They require a suite of tools to unpick what is really going on and understand the meaning behind it. And in that spirit, I'm in the process of actually developing a new test, which will hopefully be coming shortly. So there I have to finish. I want to thank you all for your time in listening. Thank you to the funding bodies who made this possible, and particularly to my main supervisor at Bath, Matthew Wills, and also to this list of other people without whom this work wouldn't have been possible. So thank you, all of you.